Hi, my name is Kristen Moon. I'm the incoming president of Alexandria Historical Society. I'll be taking over for Patrick in the fall. We have a wonderful program for you tonight. Tim Winkle is going to share some of his research. I was going to say the title, but it's actually right next to me, right here. Also, we have a couple of events that I wanted to tell you about for the fall in particular. We have something in the works on World War I for September, but we're going to leave it at this point as a surprise because it's still very much in the works. So pay attention for announcements for that. But in October, we do have Bob Zeller coming down from Gettysburg, and he'll be giving a talk. Hold on, I need to look at my notes for the title, because we changed the title for him. The Grand Review, Discoveries and Explorations in Civil War Photography. This is actually co-sponsored with the Friends of Fort Ward and then Fort Ward Museum and Park. We're gonna have it down at the Lyceum, and we're expecting a very big turnout. It should be really exciting and really interesting, and I know something that people here in Alexandria will enjoy. Now, without further ado, I'm actually gonna pass the mic to Sean Iyer, who's the head of communications here at the Masonic Temple.
Thank you very much, everyone. On behalf of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial Association, I would just like to say how happy we are to have all of you here at this special place. The memorial is, to Alexandrians, it's a symbol of the place. It's a landmark of our community. To Masons all throughout the United States and around the world, it's a beacon of another kind. And this dual relationship is something that we're very conscious of here at the memorial. If you've never been to the memorial to actually go through and see our guided tours, we are open 7 days a week from 9 to 5, and we have 5 tours daily. You can learn all about it on our website. I know that you're going to enjoy the program this evening very much, and once again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to have you here.
Good evening. My name is Catherine Weinrob, and I'm the secretary of the Alexandria Historical Society. And I am very excited to have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, as on several occasions I have had the privilege of working with him, and I can honestly say he's a fountain of knowledge on several topics. But let me read you his bio so you know a little bit about him. Tim Winkle is the archivist for the collections held by Alexandria Washington Lodge No. 22 and serves as a curator with the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where he specializes in the history of firefighting and community organizations, including fraternal groups. Prior to joining the Smithsonian in 2005, he worked at the Library and Museum of Freemasonry at the United Grand Lodge in England. Tim holds a master's in museum studies from University College London, as well as a master's in popular culture studies from Bowling Green State University. He is currently researching the role of fraternal organizations in the establishment and growth of museums in the early republic. Please help me give a warm welcome to Tim Winkle.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you'll be interested in what we've got to talk about today. Just before I start, I do want to say that after the talk, I'm inviting everybody to go upstairs to the replica lodge room, which is where we have a lot of the museum objects on display, and we're going to bring out a couple objects from the archives that aren't normally on display, both relating to the history of collecting George Washington here at the memorial, well, here at the museum and now at the memorial. So anyway, let me get right to it, and I'm going to begin in 1841. At some point in his visit to the United States in 1841, the English journalist and parliamentarian James Silk Buckingham observed the sainted status of George Washington amongst the American people. Listing some of the artifacts of Washington's life that he had viewed during his travels, Buckingham observed, quote, "These are looked upon by every American of whatever age, sex, or condition with a personal regard and veneration such as no other relics of any other national hero excites. I think in any other quarter of the world, people not only admire, but they seem to love the name of Washington and hold sacred everything that belonged to him." Buckingham's reflections are recorded during his time in Washington City and in Georgetown and, of course, in Alexandria. His opportunity to view these relics of Washington is of interest because Buckingham records no visits to any family members or acquaintances of the general, no chance to call at Arlington House or at Tudor Place, for instance. He writes of his desire to visit Mount Vernon to see Washington's tomb and to pay homage, yet despite planning several times to take this short pilgrimage, something always waylaid him, a speech in Congress or a party in the city, or, as he ruefully notes, more often than not, it was the terrible state of the weather and the impassable conditions of the roads beyond Alexandria. So apart from the general's military uniform, which was on display at the Capitol at that time, all of Buckingham's encounters with George Washington's material legacy come from his visit to the museum in Alexandria. And there, amongst what he called the highly prized relics, he lists the following: the satin robe, scarlet lined with white, in which the infant George Washington was baptized, a penknife, which was given to him by his mother when he was only 12 years of age, and which he kept for 56 years of this life amid all its vicissitudes and dangers, a pearl button taken from the coat which he wore when first inaugurated as President of the United States, a Masonic apron and gloves worn by him at a lodge meeting, a black glove, part of the suit of mourning which he wore at the death of his mother, a fragment of the last stick of sealing wax that he ever used to seal his letters, and the original of the last letter ever penned by his hand, written to decline on behalf of him and his wife a joint invitation they had received to attend a ball at Alexandria. Keep that one in mind. How this institution, the Alexandria Museum, came to possess these and other important relics and artifacts related to the life and times of George Washington, and how those same artifacts shaped the form and focus of that museum over the course of a century is really the focus of my talk tonight. So on the evening of December 29th, 1811, a member of Alexandria Washington Lodge No. 22 rose to address its members. Timothy Mountford had only joined the lodge 2 years earlier, but he had a proposal for the brethren that was unlike anything undertaken ever before in any Masonic lodge in America, something that, in his words, will, quote, not only make this lodge opulent, but for Masonic beauty, splendor, and usefulness shall rank among the first in the world. What Mountford proposed was that the lodge establish and administer what he called a general museum, to be called the Alexandria Washington Lodge Museum. As a symbolic beginning, Mountford also presented to the lodge, quote, a very ancient Masonic truncheon or staff from the personal collections of the 18th century Swiss physician and Freemason Francis de Valengen, and brought by his son to America. This gift, which is still on collection and on display, keep that one in mind, combined the Masonic antiquity with the tradition of European cabinets of curiosities, making it a fitting first donation. The minutes of this meeting note that Mountford was thanked for the gift, and the lodge looked forward to a museum where, quote, the wonder-working effects of art and nature may be displayed in all their grandeur, thereby producing a reverential respect for the superintending providence which presides over all our destinies, and happily uniting us all in the sacred duties of Masonry. In the coming weeks, the lodge would appoint a board of trustees, they would draw up articles of association, and they elected Timothy Mountford as the museum's first manager. To help it succeed and to spur aid and assistance, the lodge issued tickets granting, this is one of them that's still actually in the memorials collections, granting free entry to local clergymen, physicians, and the mayor and members of the Common Council, as well as judges of every stripe up to and including the Supreme Court. A circular was issued as well, apparently written by Mountford, and soliciting potential donors and assuring them that the museum would, quote, prove a seminary where the divine, the statesman, the hero, the philosopher, the believer, and the unbeliever may all come and learn wisdom from the stupendous works of the great architect of the world. Now, this circular was actually issued to Freemasons and non-Masons alike, and one of the few existing copies is actually with the University of Virginia collections, and it was received by Major John Mason, who was the son of George Mason. And in his return letter, which is held at the archives of Gunston Hall, his enthusiastic response was to donate several old coins and some Indian artifacts. He himself was an Indian agent. Through the establishment of a museum, though the establishment of a museum was unique in American Freemasonry, such an undertaking was certainly within the tenets of that organization. Despite an emphasis on mathematics, geometry, and the liberal arts, Masonic lodges at the time were not themselves salons or academic lecture halls, but education, both for self-improvement and for the public good, was intertwined with early American Masonry. As Stephen Bullock notes in his account of Masonry in the early Republic, American Freemasons tended to focus more on learning and on scientific knowledge, the learning and scientific knowledge from their assumed antiquarian origins, like Pythagoras or the ancient Greeks, rather than claiming a hermetic or mystic heritage that was often emphasized in Europe. In Bullock's words, quote, "The new view of Masonic history made the search for learning an important theme within American lodges." In December 1793, a young DeWitt Clinton, then secretary to his uncle, Governor George Clinton of New York, presented an address to Holland Lodge in New York City that highlighted this perspective. He said, "It is well known," talking of Freemasonry, "that it was composed of scientific and ingenious men who assembled together to improve the arts and sciences." And he went on to implore his brethren that, quote, "Every Mason ought to enrich his mind with knowledge, not because it better qualifies him to discharge the duties of his character, but because information and virtue are generally to be found in the same society." Now, this emphasis on education and on useful knowledge has practical implications. In Troy, New York, for instance, the city's lending library was essentially funded by the local Masonic lodge, and its members had free use of the books. Some lodges of the period opened their meeting halls to accommodate new and struggling schools. Some gave funds to the construction of new school buildings. Alexandria Lodge itself would lay the cornerstone of the Alexandria Academy in 1785, and of course George Washington, by then a member, honorary member of the lodge, paid an annual subscription of £50 towards the education of poor students and orphans in the free school there, and left additional money in his will. In New York City, DeWitt Clinton and other prominent Masons were instrumental in the establishment of the free school system in the early 19th century, all the way down to the donation of timber to the building of the first new school. So the proposed museum in Alexandria, it's meeting these educational ideals, but it's also meeting other Masonic imperatives as well. And in the circular, the lodge details its planned use of the institution in the promotion of the fraternal obligation of charity. This was a museum set up on the principle of charity. We usually see museums the other way around, right? So money raised by admissions was intended to create a fund, quote, "for the relief of the poor and helpless who might pass this way or dwell amongst us." Indeed, the museum opened at times under a committee of the lodge expressly for the benefit of the poor of Alexandria, particularly in the winter. These museum festivals would last several days. There would be music as paying guests would walk around and take in the displays. And as late as 1841, the same year that Buckingham visits, one festival raised over $150 for charitable relief. Now, while it may have been conceived in an abundance of Masonic virtue, the birth of the Alexandria Museum can also be seen in a larger societal and scientific context, because it comes at the start of a period in American history where there's really a proliferation of institutions and learned societies. In 1812, the same year that this museum opens, the American Antiquarian Society opens in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Philadelphia, the Academy of Natural Sciences is formed. In 1814, the Linnean Society of New England is established. 2 years later, the Metropolitan Society of Washington is convened. They would later change their name to the Columbian Institute for the Promotion of Arts and Sciences. Nobody usually makes a longer name, but. And finally, the Lyceum of Natural History was created in New York City in 1817. So there's this real foment of American intellectualism at the time, at least as seen in established institutions. And fraternal organizations and voluntary associations play a role in that as well. Many of the young nation's museum collections have been started by the efforts of such groups, though for the most part they had limited public access. One of the key things to remember about this museum is that it's public from the start. You can buy a ticket if you have the money and visit the museum. In the 18th century, library companies in Charleston and Philadelphia set up museums for their subscribers. In Salem, Massachusetts, the East India Marine Society inaugurates a museum in 1799 that brings together natural history and ethnographic material from around the world. Perhaps the most analogous example to the Alexandria Museum is that of the American Museum in New York City, founded by the Society of St. Tammany. The Tammany Society is probably one of the first truly American fraternal organizations, basing its ritual and structure around Native American tradition, specifically that of Tammany, the leader of the Lenape tribe, who, as legend has it, welcomed William Penn and the founders of the Pennsylvania colony with peaceful cooperation. For a time, Tammany was even the de facto patron saint of America, with a feast day on May 1st celebrated in both Philadelphia. So the Tammany Society in New York was founded in 1789. And as a patriotic association, it drew men from all across political class lines under the bond of liberty and friendship. Oh, thank you. And its membership was decidedly middling in its makeup. It's largely merchants, mechanics, artisans, civil servants. And they have a grand sachem, so they have the leadership under the grand sachem, and they meet in a great wigwam. And they create this kind of lively public persona by parading around in Indian dress, essentially, with regular parades that mark Independence Day, they mark Washington's birthday, and in fact, they're one of, if not the first organization in America to mark Columbus Day. This is them. The original museum was in the Federal Hall, and this is one of their circulars in the newspaper saying what kind of material they have. As you can see, some interesting artifacts up there. It's that same patriotic and Republican zeal that infused the formation of their museum in 1790. So they established the museum in 1790. The endeavor was championed by John Pintard, a New York merchant, who would later go on to found the New York Historical Society. So he always had this dream that he wanted to create this museum. His first attempt doesn't go so well, but his second one sticks. In addition to his membership at Tammany, Pintard's also a very active Freemason. The year that the museum is founded, he's the master of his lodge in New York. By its own charter, the museum was dedicated to, quote, collecting and preserving everything related to the history of America, and likewise every American production of nature and art, including the nation's political history. And funds for that museum could only be used for anything that the society deemed was of American production. So here's a museum collecting America for Americans. But they took free donations of any kind. So if you gave it to them for free, they'd take it and display it. Now soon, Tammany Museum boasted a copy of John Eliot's Indian Bible of 1663, as well as numerous Native American artifacts. Examples of American mineral wealth, flora, and fauna were collected as well. They had a stuffed bison, they had alligators, they had a two-headed lamb from New Jersey. Living specimens at the museum included a bald eagle and a gray squirrel that operated a machine for grinding pepper. So like I said, they would take just about anything. There's no direct evidence that the Tammany Museum influenced Timothy Mountford and the members of the Alexandria Washington Lodge in their endeavor, although our most famous member, Washington, was there at the time that the museum was founded. As they were leaving New York, the museum was setting up in the old congressional chambers. If anything, really, Charles Wilson Peale's famous museum in Philadelphia is more of an inspiration. In the late 1790s, Timothy Mountford had lived in Philadelphia where he had worked as a printer. He would have had ample opportunity to take in the natural wonders of Peale's institution. And closer to home, the artist Caleb Boyle opened a studio in a small natural history museum on the model of Peale's in Washington City in 1809. The building had been designed by Benjamin Latrobe. It had originally been intended for Gilbert Stuart. And Mountford and the other members of the lodge may well have taken in the curiosities at this, the first truly public museum within the District of Columbia, and perhaps were even spurred to action by its closure just 2 years later in 1811. So our museum is proposed at the end of 1811. There's Peale and Pintard. So really, although the control and patronage of the Alexandria Museum is technically under the lodge, it really is the brainchild and baby, as it were, of its manager, Timothy Mountford. like Peel and Pintard before him, it was Mountford's vision that shaped the museum and its contents, and it was he, far more than the lodge, that was indelibly linked with the museum in the memory of its visitors. Mountford was born in 1772 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. His older cousin was Tobias Lear, and Tobias Lear was also from Portsmouth, and as probably you know, was the personal secretary for George Washington in the early years of his presidency. And it's with this family connection that would really shape Mountford's life before settling in Alexandria. He moves to Philadelphia, as I mentioned, in the mid-1790s, and it's actually there he becomes a Freemason. So he's a Mason before he ever sets foot in Alexandria. And he sort of fails as a printer, although he does print a somewhat popular edition of Aesop's Fables, but he can't get his newspaper off the ground. And he fails to obtain a military commission during the Quasi-War with France in 1798. But when President Thomas Jefferson appoints Tobias Lear as American consul to Saint-Domingue, what we now know as Haiti, in 1801, Mountford apparently joins his cousin as his personal secretary. So he's kind of on the rise. But in a few months, an attempt by France that year to retake the revolutionary island forces Lear and Mountford to beat a hasty retreat back to the United States, just mere months after their arrival. So in 1803, Mountford would again join Lear as his secretary for his next appointment, this time as consul general to Algiers in North Africa. And this was, of course, a period of instability between the U.S. and the Barbary Coast powers, and almost immediately upon arriving in Algiers, Lear is diverted to Tunis for treaty negotiations. So he leaves his cousin Mountford as Chargé d'Affaires in Algiers for almost 3 years. And he returns to find his cousin has seemingly overstepped his authority. So Mountford was apparently borrowing lots of money from local moneylenders. He writes to James Madison at one point, introducing himself and basically saying, the ruler of Algiers wishes this list of things to stay friendly with America, and that includes gold and silver cloth, a 20-gun warship, a personal physician. Madison goes so far as to basically requisition a physician, a guy named Thomas Triplett, who was a member of this lodge and an Alexandrian, and he went over, and when he got there, Lear had no idea this had ever happened. So Lear makes Triplett his secretary and kicks his cousin out. So Lear sacks his cousin, sacks Mountford, and sends him back to the U.S. in disgrace in the summer of 1806. But within weeks of returning to America, he comes into Baltimore and makes his way down to Washington. Timothy Mountford appears within the minutes of Alexandria Washington Lodge as a visitor. Remember, he's already a Mason, so he can come visit any lodge he wishes. And he would become a regular name amongst the visiting brethren over the next few years until 1809, when he petitions to actually join the lodge. That same year, census information shows us that he's a boarder in Alexandria, so he's living here. And as manager of the museum, he takes up private apartments adjoining the lodge and its collections. This is of note because at this point, the Alexandria Common Council has granted the Masons space on the 3rd floor of the Market House for their lodge room and for their new museum. So I've pointed out on this rather much more modern picture, but you all know on the Cameron Street side, that's the side where the lodge was, but it was also the side where the museum was. And as it turns out, Mountford had private apartments adjoining the museum. I wish I had that great a deal. That'd be good. Oh, they take that back. They'd always want me to do stuff. So he, and it's interesting because it both shows the importance that the town holds the museum in, and the lodge presumably, similar to as in New York, where the Tammany Museum takes over in Federal Hall. There's a definite movement in early America to put museums, edifying museums in public spaces. And they may not be public museums, but they are aided by public bodies like local government to take these spaces. So the museum is valued, and Mountford gets a pretty nice house. We know from a special census in 1816, he is the only resident of the Market Hall. Though he has no military commission, somewhere along the line, his fellow Alexandrians begin to refer to Mountford as Major and even Colonel. It would appear that Timothy Mountford was not only trying to start over in Alexandria, but to completely reinvent himself. And with the lodge's resources and reputation behind him, he worked to transform himself essentially from the ashes of failure into a learned and respected academic with, if nothing else, he's got a very impressive roof over his head. Now this transformation seems to have been largely successful. His hard work was noted. Contemporaries label Mountford as a distinguished virtuoso and a gentleman of wonderful talents, who within 2 years, by 1814, has built a collection that's beginning to attract notice from outside the area. Like Peale's museum and nearly every other collection of the period, the intent is to show the works fashioned by the hand of the great architect, right? Meant to present the abundance of natural history specimens in this kind of categorization of the natural world. And contemporary accounts and later reminiscences say that the museum showed such objects as a large shark, presumably stuffed, a two-headed calf, some accounts say 3 heads, the skin of a boa constrictor, a lizard from the West Indies, preserved snakes, conjoined twin chickens, stuffed wild cats, shells from Malta, and actually one of the most interesting ones, soil and clay samples from an artesian well being dug in the market square itself. So as it's being dug, he's bringing it into the museum. A notice in the Alexandria Gazette in 1824 announces that the museum now boasts, quote, a pair of beautiful living white rats, having blood-red eyes. And you have to wonder how they fared alongside some of the living attractions, particularly the bald eagle that Mountford secured to mark Lafayette's arrival in Alexandria that same year. So were these specimens all that Alexandria Museum had to offer? It wouldn't have been entirely different than really any other museum or traveling exhibit throughout the country. But Mountford and the Lodge had something that would set the collection apart, and that is the long-standing connection with George Washington. So Alexandria Lodge had originally been warranted under the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, 1783. Many of its members were peers and neighbors of George Washington. The nation's most well-known Freemason was made an honorary member in 1784. And when the lodge moved from under Pennsylvania to the Grand Lodge of Virginia in 1788, Washington agreed to appear on the new charter as master of the lodge, and he remained in this capacity through the first year of his presidency. That is not to say he ever set foot in the lodge while he was president, but he was basically what we call the charter master. Members of the Alexandria Lodge provided the Masonic honors at his funeral, and it was that connection that moved the brethren to add the name of Washington to Alexandria Lodge in 1804. It was also a connection that had left the lodge with several physical tokens of the relationship with General Washington. For instance, the trowel with which he laid the cornerstone of the Capitol. We'll see that. And a portrait of Washington in Masonic regalia amongst them. That was my first slide as well. Here we see the lodge. Sketch is actually attributed to Benjamin Latrobe, but the lodge proceeding to that cornerstone ceremony, 1783. There's no mention, actually, in the establishment of the museum, there's no mention of honoring Washington. It's all the great works of the heavenly architect. And no early records even mention Washington, basically. But it's that establishment at the right time, the right place, just a decade away from Washington's death or a little bit more, that created the opportunity to call on his family and his friends and his contemporaries to create more around this nucleus of artifacts they already had. To create a public collection that was not only unique, but frankly somewhat revolutionary. So as I mentioned before, the blueprint for a public museum in the early republic, if there can be said to be one, is really that of Peale's institution in Philadelphia, which is essentially a Linnaean exploration of God's natural works and early efforts in what we might call ethnographic or anthropological collecting. And often museums in America had a particular emphasis on Native American antiquity. It was our way of connecting to the deep past that we didn't have, that Europe had and we did not. Of course, Peale also presented the artistic output for which he and his family were famed, so he's got his paintings up above all these stuffed animals. But the material related to the men and women who are portrayed in these portraits is not to be found in the museum. Likewise, a Swiss emigre named Pierre Eugene de Cimetière, who opened his own Philadelphia collection to the public a couple years before Peale, displayed medals and numismatic examples, some of which were his own creation, alongside cabinets of animals and minerals and things like that. But again, no what we would call material culture of America. Other early museums, including Tammany and the Columbia in Boston, exhibited waxworks depicting famous figures, but none seem to have formed a collection of what today we might see as the core of a true history museum, and that is the material culture of the past. Though its established connections to George Washington, through its established connections with George Washington, the Lodge was able to create a collection for the museum that might be considered an early prototype for history museums that would evolve in the coming decades. Museums and collections that were created not to instruct visitors on the natural world and the universe around them, but to tell them stories about themselves and about their nation's history, and essentially to create an identity as Americans. The Lodge's appeals drew donors from the immediate area and from across the country. Much of the material related to George Washington comes as a loan from George Washington Parke Custis. As Washington's adopted grandson, Custis is perhaps the most publicly connected figure to the preservation of Washington's legacy. And he had kept much of this material at Arlington House until the museum opened. In the summer of 1812, Custis placed a number of important artifacts on deposit here at the Alexandria Museum for what he called safekeeping. I'm glad to know he would keep them safe. Custis thought, though not a Mason himself, likely knew many of the Lodge's members, including George Daniel, who was clerk of the court and secretary of the Washington Society, to which access to Custis was central. In a letter to Daniel, who served many years as the master of the Lodge, he was master of the Lodge when the museum was founded, Custis promised that while he was not at liberty to donate his collections, he would keep them on deposit as long as the museum met its charitable principles on which it was founded. And some of the objects loaned to Alexandria from Custis include the christening robe, or what they called the napkin, which was displayed in conjunction with Washington's funeral bier. So you have Washington the infant and Washington in his passing. A piece of Washington's military tent inscribed in Custis's own hand, a model of the Bastille made from stone from the same prison. This was apparently given to Washington by Lafayette, and today is at Mount Vernon. 2 flags presented to Washington by the Congress at the end of the war. Oh, there we go. The Alpha and the Omega, supposedly the first and last standards captured during the war, and today those are on display at the museum at West Point. A model of the America, an early ship of the line presented by a French naval officer to Washington, and a portrait of General Washington after Trumbull, painted by George Washington Parke Custis himself. More objects were forthcoming from Washington's orbit. Lawrence Lewis presents the Lodge with Washington's Masonic apron in 1812. Washington's friend and aide, Benjamin Delaney, apparently gave the museum Washington's pack saddle, along with the skull and hooves of his horse. We don't have those anymore, and I'm really sad. Contemporary accounts list a number of other associated artifacts. Pistols presented to Washington by Louis XVI, the flag of his bodyguard regiment in the Revolutionary War, his cane, some 5 feet in length, a card table and a settee from Mount Vernon, the chamber clock, which was said to have been stopped at the moment of his death by Elisha Cullen Dick, one of the physicians who attended him in his final illness and who happens to be one of the founders of the Lodge. And along with the relics of George Washington, the museum starts to gather other historical elements, not related to Washington per se, but related to American history. Bushrod Washington names Timothy Mountford in his will, bequeathing a bust of John Paul Jones to the museum. And this was apparently displayed alongside the flag which flew on the Bonhomme Richard in its battle with the Serapis. From St. Louis, William Clark sent a donation of unknown material, but it was likely Native American artifacts. He himself started a Native American museum about 4 years later. The collection also boasted the collar of a dog named Seaman, who had belonged to Meriwether Lewis and had gone with Lewis and Clark on the Corps of Discovery. A member of the Lodge and a friend of Washington's, Jonathan Swift, arranged the donation of an ornate saddle once presented to President Jefferson by a delegation of Morocco, where Swift had served as consul. A barometer that had belonged to Horatio Nelson, which actually Mountford had brought back himself from North Africa. Perhaps also the knife that had been used to assassinate the Bey of Algiers. I haven't been able to figure out which Bey of Algiers, because they got assassinated a lot. The clothes of Tecumseh arranged on a figure of the Indian chief, and flags belonging to the Alexandria Regiment under Colonel Morgan, as well as the Richmond Rifle Rangers. The museum even boasted objects from contemporaneous events, so they're collecting as they're opening. And accounts tell of a display of a haversack that belonged to a British sergeant who was killed in action near Alexandria in 1814. It's what we call contemporary collecting. Such was the growing renown of the collections at the museum that late in his life, Mountford considered touring with the Washington relics, proposing in 1845 to exhibit them in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, having been petitioned to do so, he claimed, by citizens of those cities who had visited Alexandria Museum. The tour never materialized, and unfortunately, Mountford dies the next year in his rooms adjoining the museum where he had served as manager for over 30 years. With his death, Alexandria Museum appears to have gone through an extended period of intermittent closure, with the city government actually appointing a series of interim managers. The cross-pollination of the city government and the lodge when it comes to the museum is something I've yet to tease apart. But both seem to have a claim on it. It's both private and public at the same time. There's an account in the Gazette at some point where somebody writes in and overhears Mountford trying to sell the museum to the city at some point. So we're still teasing out the relationship there. Before his death in 1857, George Washington Parke Custis actually takes back the majority of objects he had on deposit, and rightfully so. It's no longer functioning well, so it's not living its charitable purpose. And he transfers much of this to the National Institute and other government agencies. The onset of the Civil War further diminished, let's go to this one here. So this is some of the Washington material that was on display. This would be in the early 20th century. The onset of the Civil War further diminished the museum's fortunes, although one editorial in the Gazette in 1860 called for the many revolutionary flags in the museum collection to be removed and to be given to local Confederate regiments in order that, quote, we may animate our gallant soldiers in this, our second war of independence. The swift occupation of Alexandria by Union forces quickly put paid to such ideas, thankfully. And petitioners from the lodge were apparently successful in getting the army to put a guard on the museum to prevent looting, something that would plague the collections at nearby Arlington House. A visitor's account in 1866, so just right after the war, describes his surprise that the museum is largely intact and untouched by what he called the hand of war, and much as he remembered from his youth. Indeed, efforts to revive the Alexandria Museum were underway soon after the war, under the supervision of lodge member Harry Bell, who placed notice in the Gazette calling for new donations from his fellow citizens, as well as basically a no questions asked policy for the return of any objects that may have ended up in private hands. Elsewhere, Bell touted the reopening of what he called the only museum south of the Potomac. The head of one of those museums north of the river was Joseph Henry, the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and in 1867, in rejecting an offer of several curiosities, Henry suggested that the potential donor contact Mr. Bell, the proprietor of what Henry called a museum lately started in Alexandria. 2 years later, the Gazette also reports that Bell had received a donation of the hatchet that George Washington had used to cut down the cherry tree. So such a hatchet would have been on display in that collection. I'm surprised there weren't 5 hatchets. This last donation is in keeping with the change in emphasis. So there's a real shift in the museum. Although subjective by nature, contemporary accounts of the museum's displays focus almost entirely on the relics of George Washington. You see much more mention of George Washington relics than you do of anything else, which is to be understood. And the artifacts of history in the collection, again, rather than the natural history. With established examples like the National Institute featuring historical artifacts to the public, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's success in preserving Washington's home, the museum seems to have either removed or reduced its displays of natural history, highlighting more and more the collections related to George Washington and the history of Alexandria and the nation, no matter how spurious. This trend in display may have also been reflective of a general revival in historical interest in the run-up to the centennial. Whatever the reason, it was cemented by the fire at the Market House in 1871, which destroyed the lodge rooms and the museum as well. Though some artifacts, like the funeral bier, were lost in the fire, much of the collection was actually saved, its rescuers focusing primarily on the historical relics, and especially those related to Washington. So after the fire, there's no more two-headed sheep. There's no more stuffed sharks. The museum, which had begun as an exercise in Enlightenment principles and Masonic virtue, highlighting the works of God and nature, had become almost by accident a shrine to George Washington. Now, even without the objects once loaned by Custis and those items that were lost in the fire, the museum still boasted a substantial collection of Washingtoniana. The market house was quickly rebuilt, and the Alexandria Washington Lodge was quickly returned to its former rooms on the third floor off Cameron. And this time, from postcards and photographs of the period, it's really now pared down and focusing entirely on Washington, which again you can see here, which at this point is this display case that's part of this reproduction of a postcard is actually in the lodge room. It's no longer in the museum. They've moved Washington into the lodge room. This period from the mid-1870s would coincide with an increase in tourism to the city and to the lodge to see the artifacts of George Washington. And this would culminate in two events in the late 1890s, which would really bring the collections their greatest public attention, and that's the opening of the electric railway and the 100th anniversary of Washington's death. Feeding an ever-increasing interest in Washington by tourists both visiting and local, the electric railway brought larger numbers of visitors out to Mount Vernon with stops in Alexandria, and so a visit to Washington's Lodge becomes part of the itinerary. So the 1871 fire has one final legacy. As Timothy Mountford had almost a century earlier, another member of Alexandria Washington Lodge steps forth with the proposal for the Brethren in 1908. Charles Callahan, the tax commissioner for the city and the senior warden of Alexandria Washington Lodge, pushed for the creation of a memorial to George Washington, the Freemason, and to create a fireproof repository for the artifacts in the care of the lodge so that they would never again be at risk of destruction. With the cooperation and endorsement of the Grand Master of Virginia, representatives from dozens of Grand Lodges across the country, they convened at Alexandria Washington Lodge on February 22nd, 1910, to create the Memorial Association that would see this building become a reality with George Washington's material legacy and the core that was the pioneering Alexandria Museum at the heart of this enterprise. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take a couple questions now, but again, I'm going to invite you to come up to the replica room, and I'm more than happy to take more questions there and talk about some of the artifacts I spoke about in this lecture. Yeah.
So, at the beginning of your lecture, you had George Washington's uniform on display in the Capitol. Whatever happened to that?
I can't be sure because I haven't done all the detective work on it, but I believe it's the same one that's on display today at American History in the military history exhibit. Because that, I think, was loaned by the Custis family, returned to them, and then taken from them at the occupation of Arlington House. I think that's the trace that. It's most likely that buff and blue uniform that's on display today. But I'd have to be 100% sure. Oh, sure, sorry. That question was about, I mentioned earlier in the paper lecture about Washington's uniform being on display at the Capitol in 1841. And again, I think that's the same uniform that's on display at the Smithsonian today. I'm happy to talk about two-headed lambs as well. I don't even include all the stuff. It is pretty amazing. They're actually one of the best accounts is actually at the fire, 1871, and they talk about mortars and bombs that had been collected during the Revolution and during War of 1812 going off in the fire and preventing the rescue of things. So these collections get pretty exciting. And I assume those two white rats just went scurrying out there. Yeah.
Can you compare the museum here to the other sort of big museum of the mid-19th century? I'm thinking about Barnum and his American Museum and what he's doing there, both in terms of education, but I guess edutainment.
Right.
Are they similar? Are they different?
So the question is, does this museum in the mid-19th century compare to other museums such as Barnum's American Museum in New York? Well, I will say one of the things about Barnum's Museum is the heart of Barnum's Museum is the Tammany Museum that was set up in New York. Tammany Museum eventually becomes the core of that museum, and of course, unfortunately, that museum had 2 fires and is pretty much gone by the end of the 19th century. And the question is also sort of about the infotainment that would go on in museums. Other than the balls and things like that, there's not a lot of account that I've found of entertainments going on in the museum, but in fact, there are competing entertainments going on. So there's an account in the Gazette, I think in the early 1840s, of a waxworks being set up in the city, which must have driven Mountford crazy because he thought he kind of had the monopoly on history here. So there are traveling shows that come in, and Alexandria hosts these as well. And to some extent, Mountford, the museum and Mountford are relying on the exoticism of what they can bring in here to keep people coming, but also, of course, the fact that there's that connection to Washington, and that's to George Washington himself. That's something that no other place has. This is Mount Vernon before Mount Vernon. This is where you would go as a member of the public to see the artifacts of George Washington, which are, as I said, close to holy relics. And you can pay to come in and see them. You don't have to know Custis. You don't have to know the Peter family. You can put your money down and come in and see those things. So I get the idea from reading a bit about Mountford that he tried to keep his museum somewhat pure. And again, that kind of reverential shrine to Washington, which also happened to have alligators and other things around. Yeah.
That's the barn.
Right, yeah, yes.
Did the lodge actually meet in the same location as the museum, or were they in 2 different places?
They were in adjacent rooms, but they were in the same 3rd floor location in the market house. So they would have been in adjacent rooms. I'm not quite sure. I've seen some pictures from a renovation in the mid-20th century, but I'm still not, and I probably could go and find the plans for how things were laid out, but I'm still not sure the actual physical orientation of what was going on. I do know that in the early 20th century, for instance, the museum has the colonial dames set up displays right outside of the museum. So there's this whole expectation that people are going into it as a separate entity. But it seems also that the lodge room may have been open for visitors as well because they have artifacts in there. It's hard to exactly say.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, did they meet and have their museum in the same place? The real question is, where's the museum in 1812? Where's the museum in 1814? They're not in the market house at this point. They might be meeting in Wise's Tavern or Gadsby's or whatever. The lodge might be meeting in these places. I have yet to figure out where the museum was. And maybe it's a portable museum at this point, I don't know. So they really come into their own when they're given, a few years later, they're given that place by the council. But where we know people are seeing the museum in 1814, that's my earliest account, eyewitness account of what is there, but it couldn't have been, as far as I can tell, in the market house. So where was it? How about one more question, then we'll go upstairs.
Were there souvenirs in the 19th century?
In the 19th century, the souvenirs. Were there souvenirs in the 19th century? As far as I can tell, not very many souvenirs per se. They're not like George Washington Park Custis, who would cut up the tent and give you a piece of it. Their piece was rather small. There are plenty of souvenirs, though, in the late 19th and definitely in the 20th century. There are small versions of the trowel that are given out. There's spoons. There's all types of things that and postcards. The lodge starts to produce in this period for that boom in tourist trade that comes in the late 19th century. But in the early part, not that I can tell.
So people didn't, like, after 1839, photography, they didn't want to take a picture?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I have yet to discover any early photograph, do people take photographs in there? I've never found an early photograph or a drawing even of what the interior of the museum or any artifacts in it would have looked like. The best we have are Lossings. Bernard Lossing is a historian, gazetteer, very important figure, especially for Mount Vernon and other places. He works with Custis. In 2 of his books, he talks about artifacts that are in the museum. So he laid eyes on these things. These are the best contemporary images we have, and this is from the late 1850s, when the Lodge Museum is pretty much dark. So we know these things are there, and he sketches them and a few other things, but we have no other real knowledge other than some descriptions. There's somebody who writes a fictitious serial in the Gazette about the museum, and he sort of describes like walking through it. But that's the best we have. So no, there aren't any, Mountford probably would have done well to set up a Daguerre type studio or something where people could stand with these things. But I think the nature of photography in the late 1840s, 50s, just doesn't jibe with the museum's sort of golden age. And if the museum had stayed strong through the 50s, I think we might have seen more. So yeah, should we adjourn upstairs? Anybody who wants to come upstairs, we'll go to the replica room and I'll show some of the artifacts that I talked about today. Oh, what? Oh yes, keys. So here's this, and then I think the front door is locked still too.
But it's also set up to display some of the artifacts. If anybody remembers the Masonic truncheon I mentioned, the first official artifact, there it is. So it was able to survive. And it's my favorite artifact because even though it's not the oldest artifact in the collection, it is the first official donation. Somebody says, let's start a museum with this thing. It's also probably not Masonic. So again, it kind of shows that duality of things here where, when possible, the legend is believed over the realities of perhaps the elements. A few other objects of note here. The clock, again, which I mentioned was supposedly stopped at the time of his death. I've talked to folks about Vernon. I'm not going to make a claim one way or the other on that one yet. But the trowel that you see there with the small iron handle, that is the trowel that Washington used at the cornerstone ceremony of the Capitol in 1793. AW-22, as well as Potomac Lodge in Washington, both participated in that. Washington gave the working tools and the trowel to this lodge. The working tools are on Mount Vernon and on display there. And he gave the gavel that was used that day to Potomac Lodge, and they still today have that. In fact, it used to sit quite prominently in the old Riggs Bank in Georgetown. If everybody remembers that, now it's a PVC. But anyway, that used to be on display quite prominently. And they still carry it around like the nuclear football. So if you ever have a chance to see it, they're always taking it somewhere. That's a replica of the apron, but the real apron is French, 1783. It was given by an American in France named O'Connell Watson and his business partner to mark the victory of Yorktown. It's given directly to Washington. They were Masons. They were giving their fellow Masons this prize. The documentation of that is very good. The letters back and forth are all documented. O'Connell Watson documents it in his autobiography. There's another one that's on loan now to Mount Vernon that they bring up for Washington's birthday. There were only 2 Masonic artifacts known in Washington's possession at the time of his death inventory in 1800, and also the sale to the legatees in 1802 after Martha dies, and those are bought by members of the family and taken. We had one and a lodge in West Virginia ends up together.
If you go to Christ Church on the 4th of July, you can see and touch George Washington's family Bible, which he gave to Christ Church, and we loan it to Mount Vernon. But it comes back on President's Day and the 4th of July.
So we occasionally bring out the apron on Washington's birthday. We did it this past year, but it's often on display. And Catherine's going to bring down a couple artifacts that we don't normally have on display. A couple other objects of note in here. The portrait, that is the portrait of life from Washington, 1794 during his second term. It's the only portrait from life of Washington in Masonic regalia. It doesn't mean he posed for it in Masonic regalia. I suspect the artist executed the head and added the rest. The artist was William Williams, who was an itinerant artist in this area, worked mainly in pastels. Williams is introduced to Washington by Governor Lee. The letter of that exists, and Washington's letter back to Lee exists. There's a replica of it over here that we got from the National Archives, and I'll summarize it by saying, Washington says, "Don't do this to me ever again. I don't want to sit for any more portraits. They're a waste of my time. that. But he says, I will only sit for portraits where I cannot say no without risking offense. And I think Williams, or Lee, or somebody gets wind of this, so Williams comes to the lodge and says, will you petition Washington to sit for a portrait and recommend me to do it? And that's what happens. They do. They say, we would, like an image of your noble countenance for us to be inspired by, yada, yada, yada. And Washington agrees, again, somewhat. Oh, could you just open this